Great. We have a Bible reading this morning. It's probably the most complex set of verses anybody has ever tried to speak from. So I've asked Josh, my long-suffering brother-in-law, to read for us. If anybody wants to follow, or it might be up on the screen, I'm not sure. It's Job chapter 38, verse 1, verses 12 to 18, verses 22 to 24, and then 34, all the way through to chapter 9, verse 4. But that's fine. Maybe just listen to it.
Nicole has actually highlighted it in her Bible for me, so this is great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. The Lord speaks. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, 'Here we are'? Who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the cockerel understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of earth stick together? Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? They crouch down and bring forth their young. Their labor pains are ended. Their young thrive and grow strong in the wilds. They leave and do not return."
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Lord, we just thank you for your amazing, powerful word. And I pray that as we look at it together today, that you would inspire us with your spirit and show us what you want us to hear from it. Amen. I have spent the best part of this week on holiday with my husband's family in Northumberland and our nieces and nephews, which is a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and 2 twin, nearly 2-year-olds. If any parents think that sounds like an absolute nightmare, that is the children of one family, and it is. So on Tuesday, we were on the beach, and we'd spent sort of 6 hours of sun and sandcastles and swimming, and by hour number 6, the kids had reached that kind of critical stage where you're having the best day ever, and it just sort of peaks over and turns into the worst day. It's that moment between like mad joy and total meltdown. And so the idea was, we'll take a trip up to the ice cream van to get an ice cream, and the kind of thought of the combination of sugar and a lot of dairy would kind of improve people's spirits. So everyone got ready, everyone put the shoes on, and trundled all the way up the sand dunes to the top of the beach. And as they got up to the pavement where the ice cream van was, about 50 yards away, the ice cream van kind of put on its little musical jingle. Great, good sign. Everyone's kind of deciding what they want, getting really excited. And then it turns on its engine. It's like, okay, no, that's fine. And then slowly indicates and tragically pulls away out into the distance. And this bedraggled group of children and adults just kind of stand on the curb. And the kids, you can imagine the total meltdown. This is now the worst day ever. And the kind of the principles, the twin peaks of justice and fairness of deserving this ice cream, just absolutely gone out of the window. I think they questioned whether there was a God. There was all sorts of questions going on there. So that kind of moment of fickle, childish behavior reminds us how strongly we react to moments of injustice and suffering. And I've been reading the book of Job recently, and I want to talk today about suffering and how Job helps us understand something about God in relation to the human experience of suffering and our need for justice. And I believe that God has something to say to his church about his closeness to us over the struggle, through the struggle of the last kind of year and a half, about his character and about his ongoing promise of faithfulness to us in times of struggling and suffering to come. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that all of us have suffered to some degree or another. Maybe the pandemic was the worst thing that you've ever been through, maybe not. Maybe you haven't really felt particularly like you've struggled yourself, but you felt like you've experienced secondhand the suffering of others. And in this country, we've watched other countries' democracies implode. We've watched historical suffering brought to light, and we've had disease kind of run riot. And not only here, but we've watched it in kind of closer and closer proximity that technology affords us around the world. For me, I work in A&E, and spending the bulk of last year in a hospital, I've watched the suffering of others through the external factors of disease and mental health, but I've also seen the kind of physical pain that one human being can inflict upon another. And this has left me with a lot of questions about how God runs the world. If you have been a Christian for a while, the chances are that you've probably put the question of suffering to bed because it's just not really possible to answer. Or maybe you still feel the hypocrisy of a just and loving God who chooses often not to intervene. Maybe that grates on you. Either way, have you felt this year that God is just sort of letting things slide a bit? That his job of world governance just seems to be falling apart? And the book of Job doesn't necessarily answer the question of why suffering happens, but it does provide a framework for examining the nature of God alongside the principle of justice. So it's one of the poetry or wisdom books alongside Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And we don't know whether it's a real story or not, and there's not much evidence to actually suggest either way. And you can compare it to wisdom books from other religions in other Middle Eastern countries, so from like Syria and Mesopotamia, and they wrote kind of similar things about this idea of a righteous sufferer, and grappled with the idea of who God was and how he fitted in with that. But the book of Job comes to some really important conclusions about God, and we believe that it is divinely inspired, and so it has the power to shape our perspective. As an aside, me with no theological training trying to explain the entire book of Job in 10 minutes isn't necessarily going to go very well, so I would strongly suggest reading this for yourself and studying it yourself. There's some really good resources, and it's really worth doing. So, very quick overview. Job starts with a conversation between God and someone called the accuser. And a lot of people think that this refers to Satan. It doesn't really matter who or what you think it is, because the point is that whoever the accuser is wants to do some damage, and he wants to create suffering for human beings. And he also wants to point out some major flaws in God's kind of world-running policies. So his main query is this. In order to give human beings free will, you've had to create this system where you reward moral behavior with blessing in order to keep society running smoothly. And he uses the example of a man called Job who was a good and upright, God-loving man, but was also really blessed with a lot of material wealth and had a really big and loving family. A lot like us. A lot of us. And the accuser carries on. If you reward righteous behavior with good stuff, you basically just create kind of mercenaries, almost like kind of Pavlov's dogs, not truly faithful human beings. So in a sort of experiment, the accuser is allowed to wreck Job's life, make a total mess of it, hurt him physically and spiritually and emotionally. And Job then, in response to that, kind of adds to the criticism of God's world-running policies with his second problem. If you make righteous people suffer, they won't like you very much, and they will stop respecting you as God. And the middle chapters of the book are Job in a sort of near suicidal state, really, having a conversation with some friends who use some very misapplied theology to try and work out how it fits in with their understanding of suffering. If you are ever using the open a book at a random page and see what God is saying to you, make sure you don't end up in the middle bit of Job, because a lot of it is just pure heresy, really. So what is that understanding of suffering? In many ways, it's a fairly straightforward paradigm that we have been taught as kids. If you are naughty, take apart the television, hide your sister's toys, or in one of my very heinous crimes as a child, empty an entire bottle of Yves Saint Laurent perfume into my mother's underwear drawer. Sorry, Mum. You will experience negative consequences or punishment, or you should experience punishment or negative consequences. And we use this principle, bad behavior equals bad consequences, so what we call the principle of retribution, to inform our understanding of what suffering, who should suffer, and why. So the idea is, God is just, so if you're good, you won't experience suffering. So it looks like this. Here's my little whiteboard. So I'm not a very good teacher handwriting here. So essentially, that's our little triangle that actually most of us carry around in our head. So God is just. That's okay, yeah, this one's true. And so the behavior that we exhibit and how we behave is kind of directly linked to the consequences or the kind of blessings or negative consequences that we experience. And these two are interlinked because of this one. And so Job's friends in Job actually spend the middle chapters of Job trying to take down both sides of this triangle here. And Job's friends basically say, well, in order for this to stay true, you must have not done this right. There must have been something that you have done wrong. And Job doesn't quite get to that point. He doesn't actually admit that he thinks he's actually done anything wrong. He makes a slightly more kind of nuanced claim. And his claim is that God, over here, is just, but has just sort of fallen asleep at the wheel of humanity. And that probably resonates a little bit more with the average Christian, and has certainly been not far from some of the things that I've thought over the last little while. That God is just is fairly drummed into us. That God is just, but sometimes just sort of lets things slide a little bit, is maybe deep down where some of us land when we just can't account for pain and suffering. And suffering erodes away at some of our deepest levels of trust and certainty about the character of God. When it happens to us personally, it can be absolutely catastrophic for our faith, with a lot of hurt and pain and betrayal that this principle no longer works. And when it happens to others, or when we're privy to it or exposed to it at a low level, anyone like me read BBC News every single day in pandemics in waves 1 and 2, or when you work alongside people who are experiencing suffering on a regular basis, your way of maintaining the paradigm is to make God just a little bit less than he actually is. And it's a logical conclusion to come to. But what the book of Job has to offer, and what God says in these last few chapters that we read just now, is one of the best answers to the problem of suffering. And God's answer is this. God's answer to the human experience of injustice and suffering and the resulting question about his lack of control is to talk to us about how deeply and intimately he sees, knows, and understands his creation, and therefore how close he is to our experience of life. He is present for it. He does this by firstly talking about the cosmos, so things that are way beyond and out with our control. And he talks about his ability to walk into storehouses where he keeps snow and hail, how he directs the stars' orbit, his jurisdiction over how much rain falls and when he overturns the heavens. And he then moves on to talk about his creation in a really deeply affectionate way. In the second half of the verses that we read, he knows intimately the life cycles. Thank you, love. 1 second. He knows the life cycles of the kind of whereabouts of some really elusive wild animals. And in verse 1 of chapter 39, he talks about the detailed timing of the labor pattern for a female deer, and a childbirth subject that's just so messy, so uncontrolled, so kind of animal in its nature. And he says, I see that. I see a lone deer giving birth on the plains where nobody else has seen it, nobody else knows or cares, and I know every second, I know every moment of that timing, and I count it off. And he talks about the hunting habits of lions and ravens. He talks about the roaming patterns of wild donkeys, experience of a war horse in battle. He ends about talking about his power over two kind of mythical creatures that in the Middle East that kind of represented danger. And he talks about being able to harness them, that in his power and might and sovereignty, he tames them both. He has control over both. And this text that we read deliberately discusses parts of creation that we are not privy to. And so as he demonstrates that he governs perfectly in power over the parts of the earth that we don't inhabit, we can trust him to govern in power the parts of the earth that we do inhabit. And that means for us that none of the global events of the last year and a half were a surprise to him. It means that he's been present for our internal fears and sufferings, the conflicts in our relationships. He has been proximate to the feelings of fear and responsibility and loneliness that must have existed in the private offices of world leaders. He's been present for the pain of famine experienced by families in oppressed nations. It's because of his presence and his closeness, because he has seen everything, his knowledge of our suffering, that means that he is the only being qualified to govern our world and the only one worth trusting. God's non-intervention in our moments of suffering is completely defended by the fact that he alone sees everything. From atom to cosmos, every process is under his particular watch and his omniscience. And what's more, because he sees everything, he alone is the perfect judge and able to handle the massive complexity that is justice for humanity. Imagine a court case in which the judge had been present for the crime itself. And more than that, imagine a court case in which the judge had been not only present for the crime, but present for the entire life history, the internal thoughts and emotions of the people who were involved in that crime. Would that person not be the most perfect person to give out right and true justice? So God's omniscience, and so his all-knowingness and his omnipresence, his all-presentness, goes hand in hand with his justice. And his invitation to Job as he paints that incredible picture of the cosmos and of the animal kingdom and his power over it is to trust him to govern the world. And for thousands of years, he has been doing just that. He's not losing his power, he's not letting things slip, and he is not stepping back. And I believe that the Lord wants to comfort and reassure some of us who have genuinely felt that he's kind of losing control over the last little while, or maybe even longer. Anyone who has experienced the pain of suffering and the subsequent bitter disappointment in God, he invites you to understand and experience his presentness to you. Anyone who has experienced injustice can know that he is the perfect judge and he won't let you down as a just God. Wherever your walk is with God, whether you've known God for years or whether you have only just started getting to know him, or somewhere in the middle, God wants you to have an honest conversation with him, as Job did, about where you stand. And in doing so, that as you understand that he knows intimately and understands thoroughly the whole world, that his compassionate proximity and presence to us is a part of his character that answers our need for justice in our suffering. So I just want to pray for those two groups of people that I mentioned. I don't know if Pete has any plans to... Do you want to play a bit? Yeah, if you have felt like the subject or your experience of suffering has obstructed your view of God or has made him less than a just God in your eyes, I just want to pray for you now. And I want to pray for all of us, because there will be more times of this to come, and we need to know that God is so completely present for all of those things, and because of that part of his character, we can trust him. Lord, I just thank you for your word. Thank you for the words of Scripture and for the poem of Job, which talks us through some of the most complicated and difficult philosophical questions that we have for you. Thank you that you don't shut us up when we want to come to you with questions and hurts and grievances. Thank you that you didn't stop Job from speaking when he needed to. And I pray that as we grapple with questions about ours and others' suffering, that you would show us that your answer to our suffering is to draw near to us and to be close with us. And I pray for that presence and experience for anyone here who has been through that. And for anyone who has experienced injustice, to know that God will bring justice at the end of all time. And that we can trust him to do those things for us. Amen.